So, hello, everybody, welcome. My name is Maria Hernandez Ojeda. I am Vice Chair of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade Archives. I teach Spanish at Hunter College. And on behalf of ALBA, thank you. Thank you to all of you who are attending this event today. We are very proud to present this ALBA film series discussion on the film The Spanish Earth, as part of the Peter and Carol Anti-Fascist Education Fund, and led by our wonderful colleague and ALBA board member, Joe Lavangi. So events like this are only possible thanks to your generous contributions. So please consider donating to ALBA at alba-val.org/donate. And I believe, yes, Dennis just posted the link right now in the chat. Thank you, Dennis. Very important, please note that we will record today's event for future viewing. So if you don't wish to be recorded, please turn off your camera. And now I will introduce Joe Lavangi, who I admire for years and years. And we're very fortunate to have her. She will lead the discussion, right? So Joe Lavangi is Professor Emerita at New York University, where her teaching and research has included the Spanish Civil War and how the war is or is not remembered in Spain today. She is a founding editor of the Journal of Spanish Cultural Studies. She has published widely on 19th through 21st century Spanish culture and gender studies in relation to modern Spain. And she's currently writing a cultural history of the Spanish Civil War for Reaction Books. We are truly fortunate to have Professor Lavangi with us today. And Joe, I turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria, for your generous introduction, generous as always, and we're very lucky to have you do the charming introductions to our events and be such an active member of ALBA. I'm going to assume that everyone has been good and looked at the introductory video that was circulated to you, so I don't have to repeat all that contextual information. So what I'm hoping we can do today, we have an hour and a half, I believe, is really think about how the film works as film. Think about what its components are, how it's structured, what kind of impact it makes on us. Think about any weaknesses as well as strengths, things you did like, things maybe you didn't like so much. I gave you at the end of the video introduction, and I believe it also went out in the email, a list of 4 questions that I'd like to focus on, but I've got some more questions as well that I hope we're going to have room to think about at the end. So the 4 questions, how I plan to do it is to alternate putting you in breakout groups. Dennis is the person who's the master of the breakout groups and is going to send you flying into groups and then magically bring you all back again. There's always that sort of moment of suspense. Will they reappear after they've been put in a breakout group? But Dennis is brilliant at that. So what I'm thinking of doing is getting Dennis to put you in breakout groups for the first question, which is, what do you feel about Hemingway's voiceover? Then the second question, which was about the importance of the irrigation system in the film. I thought we'd do that as general discussion. Then the third question was the depiction of village life and the use of non-professional actors, the peasants from the village, as actors in the film. What do we learn about village life? That I thought would be nice for breakout groups as well. And then the final question on the battle scenes, I thought we'd do that again as general discussion. When we get to the first breakout group, Dennis will explain how that's going to work. What I thought would be good to warm up would just be to show just under the first 3 minutes of the film. And I'll make a few comments on that as we go, just to get ourselves into the material. The start of films is always really, really important for how it grabs you. And what I'd like you to think about is not only what you see at the beginning, of course, has the credits over it, but it's important to look at what's behind the credits, but also to think about the soundtrack as well. Because we often forget how important the soundtrack is in affecting our response to a film. So will I be able to talk over the film, Dennis, as you play it, or should I wait till you've shown it?
You should be able to speak over it.
Okay.
Yeah, it'll just keep going, right? I'll maybe
Okay.
lower the volume a bit. Okay, coming in.
So Dennis, if you could play it from the start to 2 minutes 57 seconds precisely.
You got it.
And we hope no ads break in, because I found that happening on YouTube today. So it's choral music, collective, and pretty elegiac, I think. Anyway, dead serious. And then illustrating the title of The Spanish Earth, this big slow pan and choral music again. And it's folk music. And again, the camera movement, I think, is interesting.
And the faces of men who worked that earth.
I like this, that you have low angle shots looking at the peasants. Low angles dignify the people who are filmed.
Years we've wanted to irrigate, but they held us back. Now
You go from close-ups to
food
distance.
for the defenders of Madrid.
Let me get the village.
Dueña, where 1,500 people live and work the land for the common good.
The common good is a euphemism for collectivization, which is not stated because it might alienate some Americans. The posters in the bakery. Now, jolly music. Daily activities. Actually, could we stop here? Yeah, that's perfect. If we could all come back, thank you. Yeah, I didn't want to get into the ethnographic stuff until a little bit later. So you sort of gradually home in on the village, which is standard practice with a film. You start with the establishing shot and then you kind of move in to what you're going to focus on as the location of the film. And we've already had close-ups of two peasants. I think it's interesting to look out for when you get low angle shots. They're not very dramatic low angle shots, but quite often people are shot from below the waist looking up at them, and that gives people agency and authority. If you have the camera looking down on people, that takes their authority away from them. So that use of slightly low angle shots on the peasants, I think, is really, really important. I don't think I want to say anything more about that start. I will just say a little bit about the voiceover because that's the first topic of discussion. It can be a bit confusing because there's different prints of the film. There are several versions on YouTube. I chose this one because it seemed to have the clearest soundtrack. And I definitely wanted a version that has the definitive Ernest Hemingway recording of the voiceover, because as I pointed out in the introductory video, Ivans first had it recorded. It was written by Hemingway, the voiceover, but Ivans first had it recorded by Orson Welles, and neither Ivans nor Hemingway liked Orson Welles' recording. They thought it was over theatrical, so Hemingway recorded it. And well, I'll see what you want to say about the voiceover. I won't say any more. There is a version on YouTube. I thank Noel Bayliss for pointing that out to me because I didn't realize that actually has the original Orson Welles voiceover. I think it's a Korean version. I mean, God knows how they've got hold of the original Orson Welles voiceover and put it up over the film. Some films have the credits saying it's narrated by Hemingway. The version that we recommended you look at does say that. Some credits actually say still that it's narrated by Orson Welles, even though the final version that was commercially released was Hemingway and not Orson Welles. So that's all a little bit confusing. But anyway, written by Hemingway, and the commentary that I'd like you to think about is the Hemingway commentary. I won't say any more about it because I don't want to prejudice your discussion. So Dennis will explain what he's going to do with the breakout rooms, how they're going to work, how long you're going to have, and you're all, I think, going to be asked to appoint a spokesperson who will report back for each group. So over to you, Dennis.
All right. Thank you. Welcome back to the main session, everybody. Hope that was productive. So that first question you all discussed was, how do you feel about the Hemingway voiceover? I guess we could start with group one, which I believe is Adam Winkle. And Adam, if you'd like to start us off and report what your group talked about, you can unmute yourself now.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Hi, Joe. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Many years since I saw you.
Yes.
I think it was your dissertation defense.
That's it. You were there. It was good for you to be there. Group one we had mostly, well, negative to neutral comments, I would say. One participant said that she was not crazy about the voiceover in general, didn't find it effective, compared especially to Hemingway's writing, that the writing was better than the voice that was, his writing about the war was better than the voice that we hear in this, in the documentary, mostly because this film and the voice was, and the way that the film was made had so much sort of it was so direct in leading the viewers in how they needed to feel about what they were seeing, and so that that turned off one of our participants. And please, if I misquote or misrepresent your words, please say so. At the same time, we felt that some others felt that the being that there was only one voice was indicative of the type of film that it is, and that this is one point of view, and that there were no other point of views in the film. And so having that strong voice that sort of that is guiding the viewers is exactly what this type of film needs. We also talked about some of the scenes when Hemingway puts his voice, or puts the voice of some of the characters that are on the screen in his own voice. You know, they tell us to leave Madrid, but where are we going to go? Like those are some scenes that stood out as sort of anomalous to that, and maybe a little bit more humanizing. So that's probably enough from us. Thank you.
All right, that's good.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Adam. Excuse me. For group two, we had Nancy Wallach. If you'd like to report what your group did, you can unmute yourself now.
Okay. Hi, Joe, and hi, Dennis. Our group had such a rich discussion that we were even going while we had to return. So I apologize to the person that was cut off. But we started the discussion with one person making the point that we wanted our discussion to include not only the quality of the voiceover, but the content of it. And the first point that was made was that they felt that for people that may not have known that much about the war or the issues both at the time or now, they felt there wasn't enough context provided. For instance, when one of the workers says, they didn't let us work. We wanted to irrigate the land, but they didn't let us. And you might not know who they were if you were maybe not that informed viewer. And that was one example of it. Another comment was that one person, particularly when in school, had read, I think it was The Sun Also Rises, or correct me if I'm wrong, was it Farewell to, well, he had read one of the Hemingway books and he felt it was, well, written in the characteristic, very elementary style of Hemingway. And he just did not care for that style and felt it was in the voiceover as well. And then the question came up of how much of it was written to influence FDR to maybe change his opinion, and that putting the irrigation scene into it. I know we were getting a little away from maybe the narrator, and then someone pointed out the book and held it up, which was called FDR and the I believe it was the either the non-intervention pact or the decision for neutrality, and that entered into our discussion quite a bit. So I hope let me just think if I've left out any other point that was made. Just in terms of the quality of Hemingway's voice was liked, but it was felt that they needed more content and context in it.
Interesting.
Thank you, Nancy. Linda, for group 3, I believe we had Linda Willem. Linda, you should be able to unmute now.
Okay, hi Joe, nice to see you. Haven't seen you in a while. I think I saw Noelle and Linda also here. Our group started out with the first person mentioned, and I thought this sort of jumped off everything. The voice seemed rather paternalistic. It was like, we're going to tell all the story about these peasants, and so there was no voice of the Spanish people. It was the voice of the narrator. But then it was brought out that there is a voice, that you do hear the voices of the peasants in the music, that the music running through all of it are folk songs, are songs where you listen and they're literally singing. You are literally hearing the voice of the peasants. And the idea of why was it just one voice? Why wasn't it more? And so that brought up the idea of, well, what was said in the second group, what was the aim of this? This was to persuade the U.S. government to get involved in the war, to take away the non-intervention pact. And so you need an authoritative voice. You need a voice with gravitas, and that certainly is Ernest Hemingway. And also it came up that what was mentioned in the last group too, this we need more information. We need more lead up information. And we specifically talked about they wouldn't let us. Yes. And so people who don't know what the they is, but then again, that was what was brought up. Again, if this whole idea is to persuade the US government, maybe it's good to be vague. Maybe it's good not to point out about who are these people? They're communists, they're anarchists. Maybe it's good, the music sort of the folk tales and the religious sound to the music gives the voice without being overly specific of who these people are. Then we talked about what would have been like to have Orson Welles, or what would have been like to keep Hemingway. Some people really liked Hemingway because they thought that he had an objective voice. It was straightforward. It did not try to influence in an overly maudlin way or anything like that. Other people thought it was kind of flat, and it was the distance tone that to some people was objective, to others seemed rather again flat and unemotional, and that Orson Welles's voice probably, if we were looking for an identifiable voice, it would have probably been identified faster than Hemingway's voice, because he certainly has a distinctive voice, and it might have been a little overly melodramatic or not, but we don't have that. Well, I guess there is one of those out as a comparison. I'm going to try looking at it myself. So, and I think, let's see, I think that's, oh, and the idea of the music too, that the music not only gives voice to the Spanish people, but it sets a tone and a mood that goes very well with the images of the Spanish people in the village, in the battle scenes, when you see the faces, when you see them in their various emotional states, that music does contribute to that mood. And so it, along with the voiceover narration, work together with the images.
Thank you, Linda.
Great. Yes. Thank you, Linda. I believe so. Group 4, I believe Joanne Demas was your group leader. Joanne, you could go ahead and speak when you should be able to unmute yourself.
I didn't know I was a group leader, but anyway,
Oh,
people mentioned that there was feedback from veterans of the war who had been there with Hemingway that they didn't really like him there. So there was a lot of feeling against him among vets. And
I'll say a bit about that later on. That's an interesting issue.
I had the same thing my father was saying. He said all this guy do was drink, not that they weren't drinking either. But I found it kind of snide. His voice seemed very paternalistic to me. Let's see, somebody else said, oh yeah, that the music often really didn't match what was happening, that it was didn't focus because it wasn't matched to the moods all the time. And that one time there was like a horta dance during the time when the bodies were being taken away. So that should have been edited better, and let me see. Can anybody else help me from the group? Because I didn't realize I was a person. I didn't take notes. And I only spoke at the end. Group 4?
yeah, okay. Well, I think I could come back to y'all. If you're in group 4 and you have anything to say, I think you put it in the chat, but we can go over to group 5 right now, which I believe Tony Geist was the leader there.
Yeah, and first I want to apologize to my group for I hit the wrong button when it said 55 seconds left, and I dropped out before we actually finished our conversation. But we touched on a number of different points in our group that the previous groups have brought up. I think one of the interesting observations about Hemingway's narration, his voice, we have to both distinguish between and identify the voice with the text that he's narrating as well, which he was also the author of. One of the important observations was that his narration is never emotional. It's always flat, in a sense, or objective, maybe more than flat, which I thought was interesting, is low key. And one of the other group members suggested that might be so that the audience could create the emotion and would respond to the emotion. I think that the facts, in many ways, referring to what I think in group 2, they mentioned the lack of context. I think in 1937, 1938, when this documentary was shown in the White House and wherever else it was shown in the US and abroad, it didn't need more context than it had. I mean, everybody knew about the Spanish Civil War, at least in the Western world, and knew what the two sides were. But so I think that it really didn't, in that regard, maybe for today's audience, it needs more background. But I think in 1937, people knew what was going on. The lack of emotional also was mentioned in our group, the lack of emotion on the commander's death on the day of the filming. It's just mentioned as a fact, and not as drama. It's simply a fact, I think, of the fact that many people died during the war. Nearly 1 million Spaniards died during the Civil War. And then one other item that came up, and then we'll stop, was that several people in the group felt that the narration, Hemingway's narration and his voice was somewhat patronizing. I know another group said, group 3 said paternalistic. And I think that is both. I think that's less the voice than the text of the narration. So that was pretty much what we had to say.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. And Sherna, you report for group 6, and then we can go on to a general discussion question. You should be able to unmute now.
James is going to do it.
Oh, James from the Neighbors. Okay, hold on. There you go.
Yeah, absolutely. We in our group had a lot of similar strands that we've heard from other folks. We talked a little bit about the framing of the documentary being, very American centric, at times slightly infantilizing perhaps of the Spanish people. They were talked about almost in a kind of slightly medieval fantasy peasant way at times, which maybe was a tool they felt was the team that made the film felt was effective. There was mixed responses in our group also to the quality of the writing, whether it ranked amongst Hemingway's best or not such best work, and similarly his own issues with members of the Lincolns and that group's feeling about his writing at different times. Our group, I don't think, and feel free anyone to jump in if this doesn't ring true, I don't think we felt there was a real consensus that everyone knew about the Spanish Civil War, or knew about it in a substantive way. I'm curious, as the event goes on, that might be something we can chat about more in our groups. That's very interesting to me. I've never thought of it as something, even in Scotland, that sent a large number of people per capita. I don't know if it was a front page story all the time. So very curious on that. And it's funny, I can't remember which group brought up the music as a possibly useful through line. A member of our group pointed out that actually the music was often inconsistent with location or culturally not specific to what was happening. So in a sense, it came back to that idea that the folks we were seeing on screen were not necessarily stakeholders in the making of the film. And in fact, if there had been more what we think of now as prerequisites of documentary making, so talking to the subject of the documentary, cultural specificity, detailed research, that things like the music actually maybe shows the gaps there where it was more, again, not to be glib, but kind of like, and now throw some moving Spanishy music over this bit. Like I can hear Hemingway saying that in the editing suite, but then we also talked, what was the intention of this? What were the intentions of documentaries in general at the time? And many other interesting things, including, I can't remember, someone else in the group pointed out, just imagining Wells's voiceover and how different the quality of that voice would have been, and how fascinated we all are now to at least watch part of it again with that. But yeah, very, very curious for me, this question of how widespread conversation about the war was in the countries we're all from, and very interesting that there's not a consensus on that in the group.
Can I come in, Dennis, and pick up points raised, which are fascinating, because I love the voiceover. So that's really interesting to get such different reactions from many people. I'd like to clear up the thing about the Abraham Lincoln Brigade members falling out with Hemingway. That was not until he wrote For Whom the Bell Tolls,
Right.
published in 1940. And they had many problems with that, as I must admit I do as well. The general story is that they loved Hemingway during the war. I didn't just give them whiskey, he gave them lots of food, which they couldn't get either, because Hemingway was being paid 10 times more than any other journalist to report on the Civil War. Because of his fame as the author of Farewell to Arms, about his role as an ambulance, well, not about, but Hemingway was an ambulance driver in World War I, and that is, there's a sort of semi-autobiographical thing going on in Farewell to Arms. Hemingway was hugely generous as well. He put up a fifth of the budget for this film. He himself funded ambulances to go out to Spain. So it wasn't until after the war was over that the Abraham Lincoln Brigade fell out with him in a really big way. The question about the flat voice, I would say deadpan. I think if I had a very emotional voice, I would feel I was being blackmailed into feeling in a particular way. I actually like the fact, I think one of the groups did suggest that I'm left to have my own emotions. Something nobody picked up, but I think it's really interesting. There's a lot of silence. It's very sparse voiceover. It doesn't bombard us like a lot of voiceover does. It leaves, particularly in the battle scenes, there's a lot of time where we hear, noise, soundtrack in the form of noise, but there's no voice. And I felt it's fairly minimalist, and I kind of like that rather than feeling I was being told what to think by the voiceover. I think we also need to remember what documentaries were like at the time. The idea of the people having a voice, you didn't film direct sound at the time. The soundtrack was added in post-production. So it would have been very difficult to actually have the peasants speaking. What you do have is the peasants acting out their daily life in front of the camera. So I think one needs to remember that voiceovers at the time were patronizing. They did talk over the image, and the people who were shown didn't have a voice of their own. And the idea that you give a camera to people to make their own movie, which is, so important in many documentaries today, that just wasn't the case at the time. And partly to do with the technology that, the camera equipment was pretty heavy stuff. So one needs, I think, to think about what documentaries were like at the time. I was interested in the use of the first person plural, we, all the time, which maybe you find that patronizing, but it sort of brings us in with Hemingway into this collective in the village. Yes, Hemingway voicing the thoughts of people at some stages, maybe that's a little corny. On the other hand, he's trying to involve us in what's going on. One thing that really struck me, and I'll finish with this, is there's no direct propaganda appeal to the spectator, and maybe that's what's perceived by us now as not telling us enough. When this film was screened, there would have been a speaker present who would then do their pitch for fundraising after the film was shown. So we need to remember the context of how the film was shown at the time. But and that may very well have been because it wasn't made just for FDR. It was shown to FDR before its commercial release. But I think maybe there was a deliberate feeling that we shouldn't show partisanship too much. And I actually kind of like that, but it seems that some people found that problematic. Anyway, good that we had lots of different views. Dennis, how are we going to do the general discussion of the irrigation system? You're going to explain your system.
So could you just so yeah, the way we're going to do this is, everybody, you may notice on the toolbar on the Zoom screen is a little smiley face. You click the smiley face and there's a little button on there that says raise hand. That's how you, much like in school, you raise your hand to say you want to answer the question, what you have to say. So that is how we'll call on people. I see some people are doing it, so you can see how it works. And so Joe, if you could ask the question, and then some people raise their hands, you call on them and I'll let them talk.
Okay, I can only see one screen at a time, so perhaps if you can see who's raising their hands, you could then unmute them. So the question is, what's the function of the irrigation system in this film? What kind of message is being got across by the irrigation system?
Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Well, I saw, Matthew shot up when after we asked that question. So Matthew, would you like to answer that question? And then we'll go to, I think, Jennifer, you had something to say as well, but we'll go to that after. Matthew, you should be able to unmute.
Can you hear me? Sorry,
Yes.
Thank you. Pardon me. Thanks for really interesting discussion so far. Just like one or two things. When I was watching it, I felt that the kind of irrigation thing was a kind of motif running through the film. It kind of bookends it. And it reminded me in a weird way of Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, written a little bit later. But of course, Steinbeck himself was a big, at that time anyway, kind of so politically engaged person. And I feel obviously water's life, water's freedom. We see how at the end of the film the Republicans successfully defend the road. There's kind of a little victory at the same time as the water finally flows through. Again, the water can be seen in an allegorical fashion there, as being representative of, I suppose, the life or the freedom that the Republic brings. I think Hemingway actually mentions earlier on the film something like the men wanted to kind of have life or something like that, or live freely. I'm paraphrasing. So there's a kind of allegory there, I think. A kind of maybe also the more general, less specific nature, the fact that there's maybe not that much context draws into that as well. Going back to Steinbeck, it's like the idea of man's or human combat against adversity, and so it makes the film and the film's message much more relatable to people who maybe wouldn't have an understanding of the Civil War. So yeah, that's all I had to say.
That's terrific. I realize that everyone with a hand up comes to the top of my screen, so I can see everybody. So Dennis, if you'd like to go through all the hands and unmute people one at a time, that would be great.
I thought I unmuted my. Okay, great. Yeah, I can go through that. Okay, I think then, I mean, Jennifer, I think your hand was up too, but I'm gonna let you go ahead and unmute. Is it?
Okay. Hi, thank you. So really interesting film. So nice to hear everybody's comments. Thank you very much. Sorry I couldn't join the breakout group. There was stuff, as tends to happen with online, going on in the background that needed quick tending to. Not at the level of La Guerra Civil, but nonetheless stuff that needed fast, urgent attention. So sorry for that. I just want to say I wasn't going to comment on the irrigation, but since it came up, it did seem perhaps also, in addition to the obvious literal there it was happening, maybe the metaphorical aspect too of if man, and I'm using that because Hemingway talked about if men going to war, there's no face like men going to action, something like that. Even though there's the film The Woman as well, which was really interesting, La Passionata. But the idea of the water as it's like types of conflict, right? That man against nature versus man, they've managed to win the conflict, so to speak, with nature and this collectivization that Professor Lavagna mentioned. Yeah, maybe in a way to give hope for the future, that they would continue to triumph in this war, which sadly, Madrid was winning at first and then not for much longer. At the risk of backtracking a bit, I just did want to mention maybe just more briefly now. I did agree with the comments I'd heard about the negative aspects of Hemingway's voiceover. And also I did agree, I made my notes that I like that it's not too intrusive, that it's very spare, and I also really appreciated that. That was the film 1937, as everybody's certainly noted. His writing, Hemingway's writing about The Fifth Column, his only play about the Spanish Civil War, was published in 1938, and I actually thought that was the weakest of his writings. So it almost
I think it's really bad,
right? It almost seemed to fit something didn't quite kick in. you know, Hemingway, he also did start off talking about the hard, dried faces of the men, and I thought he was trying to match that in his tone of voice, even though I actually did find parts of it quite passionate. There were places where the volume seems to increase, where he's really kind of driving the point home. I had a question, just one more question, one comment.
I think we'll have a like Q&A session part at the end. And I think we can go
Okay,
into that.
okay.
But thank you,
Sure,
Jennifer.
sure.
I believe I want to make sure that I got people who didn't speak in the other section. So I think to Sherna, I believe I didn't actually speak to you because you demurred on the group leader. So Sherna, you should be able to unmute and ask your question now.
And I'll be very brief. I have a dissident voice here. I did not like the irrigation parts at all. It felt very artificial to me. And it was staged. And I really was very thankful for the introductory video about, I never viewed documentaries as something other than capturing what was actually happening. And what I liked the most about the film was the live footage. And this just felt, oh, well, it opens because the peasants are oppressed, and that's why we have this revolution. It just all felt incredibly artificial to me. If anyhow, that's part of the issue of the scripting. And that was one of my big objections to the film. And I appreciated the introductory video because I had never thought about documentaries that also included scripted, acted segments, which were really in the imagination of the filmmaker, that not necessarily of the people who are being recorded, supposedly. So that's my comment.
Perhaps I could just clarify a little bit there. The village was building an irrigation system. That's why the village was chosen. So it's not because Ivans came in and said, I want to make a movie. It's not because of that they made the irrigation system. But the filming of it was done with the villagers doing what they were doing anyway, but asked to perform it before the camera. So it is really happening. They were anyway building this irrigation system, but they were asked to do it specially for the camera at the moments the camera was filming. So it's kind of staged, but it's not invented, if that sort of clarifies that. So your view of that was actually very interesting to me. Okay, Dennis, have we got time to take a few more?
Yeah, I think maybe we could do two more and I'll try and answer them and then we can move on to question 3. I'm sorry we can't get everybody, but I'll try and go in the order the hands came up. And then also with people who haven't spoken as of yet. Steve, I think you might be next. So Steve, Mr. Birnbaum. And then we'll get Nora after that. And I'm sorry,
I'll
I
try
gotta
to be
close this question. I apologize. Steve,
I'll
go
try
ahead.
to be brief. This raises to me the issue of, was this made for FDR? Was it a propaganda film? Was it supposed to be reality? Because it almost says to me that, thinking about the WPA and some of FDR's pet projects, that this was a really nice piece to put in for FDR, since you can see from his WPA projects, this is the kind of thing that his administration loved. So, I sort of tend to think that there's a lot there. I also would love to know whether the filmmakers had a lot of dissension amongst themselves in making this film, and that this was a lot of compromising that was done to get it the way it was, because it doesn't feel to me to be a very together piece of film. That's my comment.
If I could come back quickly, it wasn't made only for FDR, but it certainly was made with the whole of the WPA, the Farm Security Administration program, trying to deal with Midwest Dust Bowl in the States in mind, thinking that the American public in general would be likely to warm to this idea of making dry land fertile, because that was a big thing in the States. In the 1930s as well. I think that's really important.
Thank you, Steve. And Nora, we'll get you. Whatever, you should be able to mute and ask your question now.
Yeah, thank you so much. So great to see you, Joe. For the first time ever, I'm the last living advisee of Mary Ellen Beater. So I think she's smiling down on all of us
That's very nice.
from up above. And this is just, it's an honor for me. So yeah, no, I think, as she always taught me to be the most cynical of of Hemingway of all time, and the narrative that we're spinning about America instead of about the Spaniard who's is living the situation. I guess what I would just like to say is I'm a little, and I don't know why I'd never seen this documentary before, but I'm so glad that we're talking about it now. I think the biggest contention is what he did in For Whom the Bell Tolls, he already does here. It's already a one piecemeal situation of an American version of someone else, of the other, that we're not even getting to see, even though so many of the shots are moving, especially the Madrid shots. I think the Madrid shots are way more moving than the village shots, because the Madrid shots, they're in agony, and the village shots, they're kind of staged, or if they're not staged, they're not under duress, let's say. But I think that the audience, I guess, for this documentary and the way that it was framed just takes away from what the actual troops on the ground for the Republic and obviously for the international brigades were doing. So when I watch it now, I'm just like, oh my, it's a disconnect for me to watch when I know exactly. We have so much other footage, we have so much other, that's what I research, and that's what we all research, right? So like I feel like we missed the boat somehow, and the people making the film missed the boat on actually telling the story correctly and telling what the stakes were, because the stakes aren't I mean, granted, they thought it was America and we want this thing to go on, but I think the stakes are confused, and that's just kind of the big picture was missed. Obviously we all know that in the Spanish Civil War anyways, but yeah.
Yeah, again, if I can make a brief comment so we have enough time left. I think the point that was made before and by Tony about, what did the American audience know about the Spanish Civil War? It was in the newsreels in the cinema all the time. And that was where you had the action. That's the way you had the dead bodies. That's where you had, all the frontline action going, which is only shot really from quite a distance here. But one thing that really strikes me, and actually it's interesting nobody's mentioned that yet, because we're showing this for ALBA, there is no mention of the international brigades. We do see an African-American soldier very briefly at one point, and there are some faces of the soldiers which look to me like they're probably not Spaniards. But there is a very good reason why the documentary it's going to be shown in America will not mention the international brigades at this point, and specifically not the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, because those who fought in the international brigades from the States were there illegally. Their passports were stamped not for Spain. They had to enter the country illegally. So it would not have been helpful to show the Abraham Lincoln Brigade in this film. But it is quite interesting. They're just not mentioned. They are mentioned in other documentaries made later on towards the end of the war, when it's a matter of raising funds to get the wounded home. So now where do we go? I wonder actually whether we do have time to talk, and maybe we don't have time for another breakout group. Actually, I think maybe we handle the rest of it. Do you think?
I think we could do question 3 in the way in which we've done it, right? This here. So yeah. So I mean, if you'd like to repeat, I think if everybody, I mean, just for fairness, I think if everybody could put their hands down, and then we'll, after Joe repeats his question, we can go. We can see who gets their hands up first for that. So Joe, go ahead and ask question number 3.
Yeah, so the third question was the use of non-professional actors and what we learn about village life. I think that's partly been answered already. Maybe some of the kind of feeling of being disconcerted that quite a lot of you have had comes from the fact that the film is perhaps trying to do 2 things. It's sort of an ethnographic documentary in the way it films the village, but it's also a propaganda film, and it's a film about a war. And then there is one boy in the village, Julian, who Hemingway mispronounces the name as Julian, but never mind, who hangs everything together because he goes from the village off to fight in the war. Then he comes back on leave, drills the local boys, and then he goes back But the original idea was to bring Julian back at the end, but that didn't happen for reasons I've forgotten now, but for logistical reasons. But I'm interested in thinking about how it might work as an ethnographic documentary. Obviously, the battle scenes are not part of an ethnographic documentary. And if anybody has any views, what do we learn about this village? It's certainly not an American village.
We got okay, yeah, so what did we learn about this village is sort of the question.
Hand up. Sydney?
Yes, we got Sydney. Sydney, you can unmute, you can ask your question, give your answer or ask your question right now. Should be able to unmute.
I was going in another direction, so I'll mute myself again.
Okay. Anyone got any comment on the ethnographic aspects of the film? Did people feel that added something?
Tony,
Yes.
Tony, you can unmute.
Yeah, can you unmute yourself, Tony?
Yeah, I think I did, right? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. As a very close friend of mine, who was born in 1960 said, he was born in a small village in Castilla. He says he was born at the end of the Middle Ages. And that's exactly what we see in the village here. I mean, it really is the Middle Ages. Compare it with images of rural US, even during the 1930s and the Great Drought. No comparison. So I think that's ethnographically, it's very, very interesting. Compared with the US, of course, which is the perspective of the narrator, but also with the rest of Europe, even. It's a very, very undeveloped economy, and not only economy, but society as well. And then the contrast with Madrid, with the city, which is 25 miles away, I think the documentary says is astonishing.
Yeah, that's really important, I think, Tony. And there's some other hands.
I think someone hasn't spoken yet. Jim Lardner, if you'd like to unmute, you can go now.
Yeah, I was just going to say there's no mention. At this point in the film, I think there's been no mention of the Catholic Church.
Right.
And that would have been an extremely touchy subject. But the fact is, I think that the Catholic Church in Spain was about as authoritarian and backward and speaking of patronizing towards peasants who were kind of a lower class. And that was, but you couldn't say all that because the Catholic Church in America was leading the charge for Franco. And so an ethnographic portrait, to be accurate, would have needed some things to be mentioned that the filmmakers did not feel they could mention.
That's absolutely spot on. And I can't remember whether it's John Dos Passos in writing later on or someone else who was there at the time the film was made in the village, did note that the villagers did talk about the church, but it was felt it should not be included in the film because it was just too sensitive. And as FDR did admit after the war, that he felt bad about not having ended the Neutrality Act that prevented the states providing any help to the Republic. But his reason was that he was afraid of the Catholic lobby and of losing Catholic votes, because as you said, the Catholic Church in the United States mobilized massively for Franco. That doesn't mean that all Catholics necessarily supported Franco, but the Catholic Church, as an official body, certainly did so. They had preachers who were very active on the radio in lobbying for the nationalists. So that was a really, really interesting point, that the villagers apparently did talk about the church when the crew were there talking to them to see what were the things that they might film, but it was felt that could not be put in the film. That's very interesting.
Great. I think Sydney is returned with a question, so I'm going to let Sydney, you can unmute and ask your question now.
Yes, it's a little more appropriate now. I think parallel and equally important in my historical understanding is the idea that the nationalists were premature anti-fascists, which I was named for someone who died in Spain in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, and I was told that they were called that at the time that they went, that they were not allowed to go to Spain to do what they went to do. So it feels like an equally unhistorical thing to have ever been thought. I'll leave it there, but I think that the idea that anti-fascism, well, it's up again this week, that could be a bad idea, never is appropriate.
Yeah, I think you meant it was the international brigades who were called primitive anti-fascists. Yes, I mean, there is no mention of political parties or any kind of political affiliation in this film, and I think that is deliberate so as not to alienate any particular spectators watching this film. So it is about peasants still living in the Middle Ages, as you rightly said, Tony, and look, they need help. Without going into party politics, the only hint of a particular party is the bread stamped with the initials UGT of the Socialist Communist Trade Union. And the voiceover just says the union stamp. It doesn't say what union it is. And that's quite deliberate. There is a scene of the celebration of the 5th Regiment, which was a Communist Party regiment being integrated into the People's Army, now centrally controlled. All the speakers are communist, and there is no mention of the fact that any of them are communists. So it is made as a sort of non-partisan film about poor peasants who are doing their best to make the land fertile, and not going any further politically than that, which I think is a good decision at the time. But it maybe does now come over as not giving us enough information about who actually are these people. If I can intervene, I'd quite like to hear Noel's views, because I know you have a lot to say about this film.
Noel, go ahead.
Oh, good. I finally found how to unmute here. Am I heard?
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, okay, good. Just a very brief comment on the absence of the church, all of which what I was hearing is pretty much spot on. Clearly, they didn't want to talk about this because it would not go down well with an American audience. But just a kind of maybe perhaps a footnote. One of the reasons that they might not have wanted to speak about the church in that particular town was that the priest, before the filming had occurred, the priest had already been shot. This is part of this war is a really brutal war. I mean, it had to be fought, but obviously there's an awful lot that an American audience just would not have wanted to hear about, clearly. But, thinking about the ethnographic impulse, which I think was really good of you, Joe, to bring up, I think of two things. I think of an earlier film, which some of you might be familiar with, that Luis Buñuel did, called Las Urdes, and it was in, I think, 1932, something like that, where he showed terrible living conditions, and it has being a Buñuel film, of course, it does more than ethnography, but it does have a very interesting ethnographic flair to it. And I don't know whether Ivans was familiar with it or was thinking about it, but it is worth remembering that there is this other film. But the other thing is the ethnographic impulse is countered by a kind of archetypal mythic, I think, tone and imagery. The water, the bread, and the land. These all have political implications, but at the same time, I think that Ivans is clearly using them in archetypal ways. And I don't know to what extent that archetypal view of the Spanish earth and the people in it works with an ethnographic impulse or not. I leave that open. Maybe someone else has another an opinion on that.
Noel, can you remember who it is who said that about the priest in that particular village having been shot?
No, I only
There's
found
nobody
that out
writing
recently.
the
Yeah,
church.
I know. It's a very interesting thing, and I will, Joe, I will try to find out where I found it because I didn't know this either until very recently.
It might be John DeSasas. I'm not sure, but yes, thanks
Yeah.
for bringing that
Yeah.
up. Yeah, I
Mhm.
mean, a lot of the propaganda against the Republic was because of its anti-clericalism. And so it was just too dangerous a topic to mention. We
Yeah.
don't know whether there was disagreement among the filmmakers, the film crew on the ground, but there obviously was this discussion about, where they talked to the village, what was important to the villagers. Some things are good for the film, some things
Yeah.
can't be put in the film.
Thank you, Noel. Again, I'm trying to get everybody who hasn't spoken yet. Peter Hartzman, you're next up. If you'd like to ask your question, we'll probably do maybe three more because that'll be what time allows. So try and keep reasonably brief your question, answer, statement.
Okay, the question I have is everybody's talking about how people were being extremely careful about what they said during the film. But was the American public itself that much opposed to what was going on, in terms of what the people were fighting for in Spain? I mean, all the volunteers went because they went, because they supported democracy, they supported land reform, and so forth. How would the people who are trying to raise money for ambulances what kind of reaction were they expecting? They're so afraid of offending people. They're basically trying to show that the terrible thing was happening in Spain and that the villagers that were working to build irrigation system was part of the contribution to the war effort. So I guess I'm a little confused at why people were so afraid to express what was going on.
I think that's a really interesting question, and it is generally assumed that the majority of the public views that were expressed in public, because we don't know about views that were never expressed in public, were in support of the Republic. But there was also a lot of support, I've already mentioned the Catholic Church, that was very aggressively against the Republic. And I think one should also remember that the film was shown largely in kind of union venues, at fundraising events. It was largely shown to places where there would either be, it was very shown in private homes in Hollywood, which raised a lot of money. You had to pay money to get in to watch it, like a sort of gala. It was shown in places where maybe it wasn't preaching to the converted entirely, but where there was likely to be a sympathetic audience. The makeup of the International Brigaders, very, very strong union presence there. Strong presence of Communist Party, that by no means all of them were communists, but most of them were very much involved in union work, working class. So it's impossible, I think, to generalize about the American public. This film would not have been shown in venues with a hostile audience. It was not widely shown in commercial cinemas because commercial cinemas just didn't show documentaries, full stop. So I think one just has to remember it's a very, very diverse audience, not split probably 50-50, but very, very split on the issue. And we are in the same situation today, if I can sort of remind us.
Thank you. Next up, Nancy Wallach, if you'd like to ask your question, and maybe we'll do Peter Stoll after you, and then I may have to wrap. Apologies for that, but time is limited.
What you're mentioning of the influence of the hierarchy of the Catholic Church on Roosevelt and his necessity of needing them for his New Deal coalition, which came up in our discussion. But you also mentioned that not necessarily all Catholics felt that way. And I just wanted to mention there was an effort to reach lay members of the Catholic Church. There was a priest called Michael O'Flanagan, who came over from Ireland and actually spoke at Madison Square Garden and around the country in favor of the Republic. And he was not typical of the Catholic Church in his own country either, because we know that they very much supported O'Duffy's group, which went over and they framed it in terms of religion versus the non-communism. But this Michael O'Flanagan, he pitched his speaking tour throughout the U.S. to try to win over the lay Catholics to support for the Republic.
Oh, thank you, Nancy. That's really interesting.
And there's a book that was fairly recently published about him called "They Have Fooled You Again."
Oh, really? Oh, I'll look that up. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Nancy. Yeah, and I believe, not to interject something, but I believe Jim Fernandez, a friend of ALBA, did some ethnographic work on Spaniards in New York and a lot of the, sort of fighting between the Catholic Church and the communist groups here who are fighting hearts and minds and stuff like that. Peter Stoll, you can ask your question now, and then we may have to, do with Joe if you want to prepare, kind of wrap up, and then I can send us off. Okay, Peter, go ahead.
Okay, I guess this is a quick question for let's see, what's your name? Josephine? Okay, I thought I saw a point, I think it was around minute 8 in the film, where they were trying to promote the idea that the People's Army was competent, and they were talking about the leadership, and they presented a general or a leader. They often came from low, but anyway, and they highlighted this general who was killed. Do you recall that, Josephine? He was shot,
yes,
and
yes.
they said
Not a
that
general. I forget. He's a commander of some kind, but he's not a general.
Yeah, a commander. That's right.
Yes.
Commander of a regiment. I think maybe he was trying to defend Madrid, but who killed him? It said communist agents.
No, that was not said in the film. I mean, he was killed in battle.
Oh, he was killed in battle. Wasn't there some mention of a communist agent killing somebody?
No, the word communist doesn't appear in the film at all.
All right, I'm sorry. Okay.
Said about the working class origins of many of the military leaders.
Right.
That comes later in the film, the ceremony integrating the 5th Regiment, which was a communist regiment, into the People's Army. There you're told the working class origins of General Lister and other leaders as well. But the word, they are all communists, but the word communist is not mentioned at all.
Okay,
no,
I'm sorry. Okay, it must have gotten mixed up.
No, but I'm glad to clarify that one.
All right, yeah, there was some kind of anyway. There's Stalinist agents that assassinated certain leadership.
You may be
they
thinking
didn't like.
in my video introduction, I mentioned.
Oh, that's where it was.
Tassos's problem with the Republic when he discovered that his translator Nobody knows quite what happened to him, but he is believed to have been shot by Soviet agents. He was
That
working
was
with
it.
Soviet military intelligence in Spain. And actually,
Yes.
historian Paul Preston, I mean, nobody knows exactly what happened, but the historian Paul Preston, interestingly, he has a whole chapter in his book on journalists in the foreign journalists in the Spanish Civil War. Paul Preston came to the conclusion that the accusation may have been correct. But we don't know.
Okay, I'm sorry, I was conflating your
Right, yeah.
comment there with something I just
No,
watched
I mean,
before the film.
certainly there
I'm
were
sorry.
killings by Soviet agents in Spain. That is one of the nasty sides of the war. It's not in this movie, but it happened.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Joe. Yeah, I mean, I think we're coming up on time, so I think I'm sorry I can't get to all the questions here, but Joe, is there anything you'd want to wrap up about the film? Any parting thoughts?
I'd like to just say a little bit about the battle scenes, which we haven't had time to really discuss. Some of it was live footage with Joris Ivan's film crew there. Quite a lot of it is taken from newsreels that were filmed, to be shown as news in cinemas. I was just kind of struck by the fact that there's quite a lot of close-ups of soldiers in those battle scenes, intercut with the long distance stuff. The noise would all have been done post-production back in New York, or it had been taken from newsreels that were filmed, but not by Joris Ivan's film crew at the time. But I thought it was interesting. There's a systematic effort to kind of intercut the kind of long distance panoramic views of the battle with, we see smoke, cannons going off, noises of shells, etc. But there's a sort of humanizing quality by intercutting that with close-ups of faces. And in the battle for University City, quite a lot of the filming is done from the viewpoint of the soldiers who they're there with their gun pointing through a gap in the ruin of the building they're in. And we are with them looking out at the enemy from their point of view. And I thought that was actually quite interesting. Also, I think the last thing I'd like to say is that Hemingway's commentary does not vilify the enemy, and it could have done. And he talks about the Moorish mercenaries, the Moroccan mercenaries fighting for Franco as brave troops. And then when he's showing us some dead Italian soldiers killed in combat, he says, and their letters were very sad. I thought that was actually really important, that he doesn't turn it into a goodies versus baddies story. He's sorry for everybody who gets killed. So I'm sorry people didn't like the voiceover much, because I love it actually. It was actually really interesting for me to find what so many different reactions, which I wasn't quite expecting. So thank you for all of your comments.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And thank you, Joe, for taking the time to do all this and share your thoughts on the film. Yeah, so again, my name is Dennis. I'm the executive assistant here at ALBA. I do want to pitch everybody again. This program was great. We can do programs like this free of charge because we are a nonprofit. We can do those programs with support from people like you. If you feel you have a few bucks to spare, you can donate on our website. And throw us a few dollars that way. We will be having more of this our film series. The next, mark your calendars, the next film in the series is Land and Freedom. I think it's Ken Loach's Land and Freedom, which will be on December 18th at 4 p.m. Eastern time. That the time might change, but I think it's going to be 4 p.m. So on December, I think it's a Wednesday, December 18th. So we'll be doing Land and Freedom. You're all on the mailing list now, so you'll get a notification for that for when we are accepting tickets. It'll be in the same setup as this. So again, I want to thank every single one of you for coming and joining us, and having such good questions. You will receive an evaluation email from me that will include a recording of this event. So you and anybody who has not watched it, was not able to attend, will be able to watch and see all your very good questions and discussions, excluding the breakout room area. So yeah, thank you all again so much, and really appreciate it. And have a good rest of your night or day, depending on where you are, I guess.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.